Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Dorian Quill. Before the outbreak, I worked code compliance and safety inspections for the city and a few private firms. On paper, the job was simple. I walked commercial buildings, checked fire exits, tested alarm banks, and filed reports that nobody wanted to read. Until something actually caught fire. I spent a lot of time around Seattle Center, making sure tourists could get up and down the Needle without dying on the stairs. Back then, the Space Needle was just another line item on my schedule. I knew the service doors, the back-of-house corridors, and the dead zones where guests never set foot. I knew which maintenance panels hid the master breakers, and exactly which keys on my ring opened the perimeter gates. Most days, I'd walk the grid, sign a form in the manager's office, and go home feeling like my signature didn't really matter. Then the news changed tone. First, it was just background noise, stories about a strange flu and crowded hospitals on the East Coast. Then the alerts started naming places I knew. Downtown clinics, ERs in Northgate, a shelter I had inspected 2 months earlier. The city pushed out a notice that all non-essential attractions would close until the curve flattened. That list included the Space Needle. People always think the mob runs to the big landmarks when society collapses, but that isn't how it works. They ran to grocery stores, pharmacies, and schools labeled as aid stations. They fought in parking lots and grocery aisles while the tower stood over them, dark and locked, with the lights cut and the doors chained. I watched the city bleed out street by street. Fewer cars, more sirens, then silence. When my own building started to feel crowded and the walls felt too thin, I stopped thinking like an inspector. I started thinking like a man who needed the one fortress he knew how to hold. The city didn't drop in one night. It sagged, buckling piece by piece under its own weight. At first, it was the small code violations that only a guy like me would catch. Fire doors propped open with overflowing trash cans because the janitorial staff stopped showing up. Elevators stuck between floors because the service techs were all out sick. Alarm panels that triggered faults and just stayed in yellow trouble mode because no one answered the service calls. The news rolled in behind the physical decay. A grainy clip of a man attacking nurses in an ER played on loop on every screen in the city. Then, shakier footage of security guards trying to pin people down while doctors shouted for restraints. The audio was the worst part. The wet animal sounds of patients biting the people trying to save them and refusing to let go. The city pushed one alert about a short, shelter-in-place request for a few blocks near a major hospital downtown. 2 days later, that turned into a citywide mandate. Stay home. Avoid public gatherings. Keep phones charged for emergency broadcasts. Metro buses switched to Sunday schedules, then stopped running entirely. The lights in the stadiums and downtown venues went dark. I spent those days in my small apartment in Lower Queen Anne, 3 blocks from the Seattle Center complex. My windows faced the hill and the tip of the Space Needle, which poked through the constant low-hanging clouds. From my kitchen table, I watched the last normal crowds at the base evaporate. I watched the traffic thin out as the city notices went from polite recommendations to hard, enforceable closures. One afternoon, my department forwarded a memo from the mayor's office. All non-essential attractions were to cease operations by Friday. Staff were to be sent home or reassigned to aid stations. The order specified a skeleton security detail pending final sweep. But essentially, the building was to be sealed. The Space Needle sat right in the middle of that list. That told me 3 critical things. 1, the tower would be locked down systematically, not abandoned in a panic. 2, the civilians would be gone. And 3, once those perimeter gates were chained, nobody would have a reason or the specialized keys to open them again. Grocery stores didn't have that luxury. Hospitals and schools turned into chaos zones while the Needle emptied out into silence. I kept telling myself the smart play was to stay put. The news anchors used their calm, practiced voices, repeating the same script every hour. Stay inside. Trust the protocol. Do not clog the arterial roads. but my job had taught me something the anchors didn't see. Most apartment buildings in this city are built to pass minimum code, not to hold under siege conditions. Drywall is just paper and chalk. Hollow core doors are basically cardboard. One broken lock turns a whole floor into a public hallway. One fire door wedged open turns a secure exit into a chimney for smoke or a funnel for bodies. The first night I heard real violence at ground level. The walls of my apartment felt terrifyingly thin. Somewhere down the block, a crowd started yelling, not a protest, but a panic. Metal rang out like a bat hitting a dumpster. A woman screamed 3 times, sharp and jagged, and then just stopped. Sirens cut through the rain, wailed for 10 seconds, and then died mid-sound. From my peephole, I saw people sprinting past the lobby glass with blood on their sleeves and no jackets, shivering in the cold. Crowds had never bothered me before that week. Now every group looked like a biological hazard. The Space Needle kept drawing my eye. It was tall, detached, and solitary. One narrow concrete core, one saucer of decks. No ground-level windows to smash, no alley doors to kick in. I knew the schematics. I knew the service tunnels running under the center. I knew which staff entrances were tucked away behind landscaping. If the city's plan was to herd everyone into flat, crowded shelters like cattle, I wanted the exact opposite of that. There were obvious problems. The tower wasn't a bunker, it was a tourist trap. Glass walls are great for panoramic photos, terrible for cover against small arms fire. The kitchens were stocked for weekend brunches, not for a month-long siege. The bathrooms relied on municipal water pressure. The heat came from the grid, not a wood stove. But the geometry was right. Height, verticality, controlled access points, enough square footage to carve out quarantine zones. If I could get inside before the grid really collapsed, I could work the problem. Walls and windows could be reinforced. Supplies could be hoisted. Water could be stored in gravity tanks. Heat could be improvised if you knew how airflow worked. I sat at my table and made a list. Pros, high ground, familiar layout, likely empty after the mandatory shutdown, 360-degree sightlines, short movement from my current location. Cons, exposure to wind and weather, zero starting supplies, absolute dependence on stairs and elevators. The list didn't make the choice for me. The next night did. The power flickered 3 times just after midnight. A transformer blew somewhere nearby with a sound like a shotgun blast. The building came back on emergency backup lighting for a while, but the streetlights stayed dead. In the gaps of darkness, shapes moved on the wet asphalt below. They weren't just people running away from something. These bodies moved fast, tripped over curbs, and scrambled back up with a strange, broken rhythm that looked all wrong. Someone on my floor pounded on a neighbor's door, shouting for them to open up, screaming that the hall wasn't safe. Their voice cracked into a sob halfway through the sentence. When the door finally opened, I heard a scuffle as 3 people forced their way into a space meant for 1. My building was already turning into its own desperate, overcrowded shelter. Paper walls, too many unsecured doors, too many strangers between me and the exits. The next morning, the emergency alert system pushed one more notification to my phone. It was shorter than the others. Shelter in place. Do not travel. Emergency services overwhelmed. The last line was the kicker. Some designated facilities have been compromised. That was my answer. I could stay here and hope my hallway didn't fill with the wrong kind of noise. Or I could move while there was still daylight and try to claim the one tall, locked structure within walking distance that I understood better than the managers who ran it. I didn't pack for a move. I packed for a shift that wouldn't end. Steel-toed work boots, Carhartt jacket, mechanics gloves, 2 changes of durable clothes, multi-tool, pry bar, lock picks. A tactical flashlight with every spare battery I owned, my inspection bag with the master keys and old magnetic access cards, a compact first aid kit, canned food and bottles of water. And finally, the .38 revolver my father had insisted I keep in a lockbox, a gun I had cleaned twice a year but never fired at anything living. When the duffel bag was zipped, my apartment felt like a room I had just walked through for a final checklist. Noise was already leaking up from the lobby, shouting, breaking glass. I looked at my front door and decided I'd rather take my chances with the elements than wait for that chaos to reach my floor at 2 in the morning. The Needle stood 3 blocks away, rising over wet streets and stalled SUVs, locked, dark, and as close to neutral ground as anything left in Seattle. I threw the strap over my shoulder, stepped into the corridor, and headed for the fire stairs. The stairs in my building were a bottleneck. Families stood on the landings with suitcases jammed between their feet while a battery-powered radio repeated the same automated loop to shelter in place. I kept my head down, shoulders hunched to hide the shape of the pistol under my jacket, and moved past them. When a neighbor grabbed my sleeve and asked where I was going with a full pack, I didn't break stride. I just said, "Work calls, stay safe inside," and hit the next flight down before he could ask for help I couldn't give. Seattle Center was only 3 blocks away, but it felt like a different planet. The Space Needle rose over the low buildings, its saucer lost in the overcast gray soup. On a normal day, the base would be swarming. Today it was a ghost town. 2 police cruisers blocked the valet drop-off. Their light bars were dead. A folding sandwich board that usually listed ticket prices held a printed notice taped over the front. Closed until further notice. No public access. A plastic yellow chain sagged between 2 stanchions in front of the main revolving doors. There were no guards at the perimeter. Whatever shutdown protocol they ran it early. Clear the structure, lock the grid, and move personnel. Empty on purpose was better than abandoned mid-shift, but it didn't guarantee safety. I stayed off the exposed concrete and hugged the landscaping. Distant engines and shouting echoed off the Museum of Pop Culture, but nobody looked toward the Needle. It was just scenery now. On the north side, a narrow service drive ran behind the loading dock. I knew it from fire code checks. A heavy steel gate blocked the path, held shut with a chain and a municipal padlock. Beside it was a small gray HID badge reader. I scanned the street, verified no eyes were on me, and wiped the rain off the reader. I fished my old contractor badge out of my pocket, plastic I hadn't used in 6 months, and pressed it to the face. The LED flashed green once. The heavy solenoid clicked. The chain sagged as the maglock disengaged. I pushed the gate open just enough to slip through, then pulled it shut until the magnet engaged again with a solid thud. The service lane was empty and slick. Halfway down, a steel door sat under a dripping awning. This was the egress for kitchen staff. The deadbolt turned on the 5th key on my ring. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of industrial cleaner and static. The overhead lights were cut, but dim emergency fixtures cast just enough green glow to reveal a corridor of lockers. I closed the door, engaged the deadbolt, and listened. It wasn't quiet. A low, wet, scuffing sound came from the direction of the main lobby. I drew the revolver and moved up the service stairs. Before I reached the top, I saw a dark smear on the linoleum. Not a puddle, a drag mark. A heavy boot had slid through blood and pulled it toward the lobby. I followed the trail. At the top, the glass security door looked out over the ticket counters. The daylight from the massive front windows made the shapes clear. The lobby looked orderly, except for the body in a security uniform lying near the center kiosk. One shoe was missing. The throat was torn open. I didn't have time to analyze it. A noise came from the manager's office to my left, a rhythmic thumping, like someone bumping into furniture. The door was ajar. I moved fast, stepped through the frame, and raised the gun. A man in a maintenance jumpsuit was inside, pacing in a tight, confused circle. His face was gray, eyes clouded, mouth a mess of dried blood. He saw me and didn't speak. He just hissed and lunged. I didn't fire. A gunshot in a glass lobby would ring like a dinner bell. I stepped back, let him clear the doorway, and swung the heavy steel pry bar from my belt. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crunch. He went down hard and stopped moving. I stood over him, adrenaline spiking my hands. I checked the office. Empty. Checked the dead guard. No keys, dead radio. The maintenance guy had turned, surprised the guard, killed him, and trapped himself in the office loop. Mystery solved. I didn't linger. Crossing the open floor of the lobby felt like walking naked down a highway. I moved straight to the elevators, but I knew better than to trust them. The main doors were taped shut. I pressed the call button on habit. Nothing. To the right, a short hallway led to the internal stair access. The fire stairs wrapped around the core. The badge reader was dead here. I set the tip of my pry bar into the gap, leaned my weight into it until the metal frame groaned and felt the catch slip. The door popped open. The stairwell was a concrete tube smelling of damp dust. Small emergency strips ran up the center post. I started the climb. It was a steady, brutal ascent. I took the steps at a measured pace, pausing every 2 flights to listen. On the 520-foot landing, I found a line of bloody fingerprints marking the wall, dragging upward for 2 steps before stopping. Whatever made them hadn't gone all the way up. When I pushed through the heavy fire door to the observation level, the light hit me from all sides. Floor-to-ceiling glass wrapped the room in a ring, and gray sky filled every pane. The city spread below, a grid of wet streets, flat roofs, and the dark water of the Sound. A thin column of black smoke rose to the south. The deck was empty. No guests, no staff. A stack of folded shirts sat on a cart near the gift kiosk, untouched. I set my pack near the inner concrete core, away from the glass, and turned in a slow circle. From up here, the silence was absolute. I could see traffic gridlocked on I-5 and small clusters of people moving in the streets below, looking like ants with that same jerky, aggressive rhythm. The tower was locked, but not secure. The glass doors at the base could be smashed. The stair was open. Anyone with a crowbar could follow me. But this was higher and clearer than anywhere else. I sat with my back against the central column until my heart rate dropped. I had a dry floor, a view, and a little time before dark. This wasn't safety yet, but it was a start. I pulled my notebook out and began making a list of every weak point I had seen on the way up. The glass was problem number 1. The open stair was number 2. Being alone in a tower built for thousands was problem number 3. The first objective was simple: perimeter denial. I needed to ensure no one could walk up behind me without a fight. The second was to stay alive long enough to formulate a phase 2. I started my fortification at the top, not the bottom. If someone forced the ground level, I wanted them exhausted by the time they reached my ground. The observation level was too exposed, too much glass, too much visibility. But the central elevator core was solid concrete. That became my anchor. I picked a quadrant near the core with no direct line of sight to the windows and designated it as base camp. 2 heavy banquet tables flipped on their sides created a low, defensive wall. A stack of hoodies from the gift kiosk, still in their plastic wrappers, turned into a makeshift mattress. With a drop zone established, I headed back down into the dark. Every landing on that stairwell felt like a potential ambush point. I descended with one hand on the rail and the other tight on the grip of the 38. At the lobby level, I stopped 10 feet short of the door and just listened. No voices. No scuff of shoes. Just the faint, muffled wail of sirens penetrating the front glass. The dead guard was still where I left him, a grim sentry for a building that no longer needed guarding. I swept the corners with my light, then moved to the main entrance. The glass panels were wide, clean, and terrifyingly fragile. The tape and chain loop were merely suggestions. They wouldn't stop a brick, let alone a determined mob. I wasn't going to turn the needle into a bunker in one afternoon, but I could make it painful to enter. I raided the lobby for mass. Heavy steel trash bins, metal signage frames, and wheeled display cases became my raw materials. I dragged them behind the main doors, creating a chaotic, noisy barricade. The goal wasn't to build an impenetrable wall, it was to create a fatal funnel, an obstacle that forced anyone entering to climb, stumble, and make enough noise to wake the dead. The staff door I had used to enter got special attention. From a nearby storage room, I pulled a heavy metal shelving unit and tipped it on its side across the interior frame. I found a set of ratchet straps in a maintenance closet and lashed the shelf to the wall conduits. It wouldn't stop a truck, but it would stop a kicker. If someone wanted this entrance, they would have to dismantle it piece by piece. Work takes time. Work makes noise. Noise travels up. Back on the upper levels, I forced myself to take inventory. The rotating restaurant's kitchen sat one floor below the observation deck. I went down with my flashlight and raided the walk-ins. The shelves were stocked with dry goods, and the coolers hummed with thousands of dollars of inventory that was already on a countdown to rot. I couldn't keep the fridges running forever, so I prioritized shelf-stable calories. Sealed bags of rice, flour, and beans went into rolling bins that I pushed up the ramp to the core. The perishables, steaks, fish, fresh vegetables, I cooked in a marathon session over the next 2 days. The gas ranges still worked, fed by line pressure that hadn't failed yet, and I seared everything I could, eating the best meals of my life while the city fell apart below. Water was the real ticking clock. The taps still sputtered, fed by the gravity tanks on the roof, but once those drained, the vertical distance would kill the pressure without electric pumps. I filled everything that could hold liquid: pitchers, plastic bussing tubs, drink dispensers. I found a janitorial closet full of distilled water jugs and added them to the stockpile. Water in a municipal pipe belongs to the city. Water in a jug belongs to the man holding it. Heat was the problem I couldn't engineer away that first week. The HVAC system pushed a little residual warm air, but the building was essentially a glass fin in the wind. I pulled wool blankets, tablecloths, and merchandise up to my corner. Using duct tape and binder clips, I built a thermal envelope, a tent within a room around my sleeping area. It trapped my body heat and created a pocket of air I could keep above freezing. The rest of the ring could stay cold. By the time the ambient light faded from gray to black, the top of the needle looked less like a landmark and more like a squatter's camp. Tables overturned, boxes stacked against the concrete, a taped-off sleeping fort, a perimeter of water jugs. I set SOP, standard operating procedure, before I laid down that first night. 1. No trips to ground level after dark. 2. No opening external doors unless the room is on fire. 3. Stay away from the glass when emergency vehicles pass. 4. One ear on the stairwell at all times. I wrote them on the back of a dinner menu and taped it to the column near my head. Sleep came in jagged, anxious bursts. I woke at every groan of the steel structure shifting in the wind. Once near midnight, something hit the main lobby doors hard enough to vibrate the glass. I killed my lantern, lay flat behind the tables, and stopped breathing. A second impact came, dull, heavy, then silence. The barricades were not a wall, but they were a test. Whoever or whatever had hit them had failed. Morning light revealed the aftermath below. More stalled cars, a few bodies on the plaza that hadn't been there yesterday. 2 figures moved slowly up the sidewalk, their gait wrong, arms hanging dead, steps dragging on the concrete. They passed under the tower without looking up. Elevation was my greatest asset. I could observe the threat without becoming part of it. That first stretch ended with no breach at my door and a rough blueprint for survival. I had the high ground. I had a stockpile. I had soft walls that needed hardening and doors that needed teeth. And I had a narrow concrete stairwell that sooner or later something was going to try to climb. By day 3, my universe had shrunk to a very short checklist. Secure the doors, patrol the stairs, cook the perishables before they rot, keep my hands busy and my socks dry. Everything else was a luxury I couldn't afford. The stairwell was the artery of the building, and it sat at the center of every plan. That concrete spiral was the real front door. I walked the entire run repeatedly, one hand hovering over the rail, counting steps until the geometry was burned into my brain. On the wider landings, I tested what I could move solo and stacked it where it created the most friction. Cafe tables, lighting rigs from the storage cages, an under-counter freezer that was more frost than structure. Using ratchet straps and cable ties, I turned that junk into choke points at 2 critical spots, one near the ground level and one just below my camp. Hauling that scrap was exhausting, but the labor kept my head in a narrow lane. On each landing, I paused to listen through the fire doors. No voices, no scuff of shoes on tile, just the whistle of wind against the superstructure and the groaning of steel shifting under the weather. It felt like progress. The mistake happened in the kitchen. The walk-ins were still humming, packed with food that was on a ticking clock. Crates of produce, dairy, and trays of prepped proteins waiting for tourists who never showed up. My logic was sound. If the grid died, cooked food would be easier to manage than raw meat. I had stockpots simmering on every burner that still had gas pressure. Rice, pasta, a heavy stew of beef and root vegetables. I was moving between the range and the prep counter, a chef's knife in one hand and a rag in the other, listening with half an ear for the stairwell door. Grease on the quarry tile near the line. I had written up this exact violation on inspection reports a dozen times. Grease buildup near hot line. Slip hazard. Immediate action required. The irony didn't stop my boot from losing traction. My heel hit a slick patch I missed in the dim light. I went down hard, sideways. The large stockpot I was shifting tilted. A wave of boiling water and rendered fat spilled over the rim, cascading across my right forearm and the back of my hand before the metal slammed onto the tiles. For a second, I didn't move. The heat soaked into the fabric of my sleeve, and then the pain hit. A white-hot spike that blanked out every other thought. I kicked the pot away, scrambled up, and dragged myself to the prep sink. I cranked the cold tap and shoved my arm under the stream, clenching my teeth so hard I thought they'd crack. The damage was immediate. The skin turned an angry, bright red, and massive blisters began to bubble up near the wrist while I watched. My fingers shook so violently I could barely unzip the small tactical first aid kit from my pack. Inside it was a joke. Basic adhesive pads, a small roll of gauze, a packet of antibiotic ointment, and some ibuprofen. Enough for a paper cut, not for a second-degree scald that had just compromised my dominant hand. I wrapped the forearm as best I could using a clean tablecloth cut into strips and sat on a milk crate with my back against a stainless fridge. Every time I tried to flex my fingers, a sharp line of fire shot up to my elbow. Cold sweat pricked my neck. One clear, terrifying thought pushed through the pain. If this wound got infected, and in a damp, non-sterile building it would get infected, there was nobody to fix it but me. And I didn't have the tools. Until that moment, I had treated the needle like a geometry problem. Distance, thickness, tensile strength. Now the math included my own biology. Routine labor here could kill me just as easily as the infected outside. A fall on the stairs, a deep laceration from broken glass, a twisted knee. Alone, any of those were terminal. The burn wouldn't kill me today, but without sterile dressings, burn cream, and heavy-duty antibiotics, it could turn septic in a week. The Space Needle had silverware for 500 guests, but not one proper trauma kit. Later, I sat on the observation level with my arm elevated and throbbing, looking out over the darkened grid of the city. The tower gave me height and sightlines, but it offered zero resilience. One slip had just eaten through the safety margin I thought I had. If this place was going to be a fortress, I needed a pharmacy, not a first aid kit. I needed Silvadene, sterile gauze, and a course of broad-spectrum antibiotics. That meant going back down. It meant walking open streets in daylight while I could still stand straight and shoot with one good hand. Waiting until the red streaks of infection started climbing my arm would turn a supply run into a suicide mission. The bodegas and convenience stores around the center sold Band-Aids and energy drinks. That wasn't enough. I needed a pharmacy or a clinic. The closest ones I knew from my old inspection routes were a chain drugstore 6 blocks east and a small urgent care clinic further down the hill. Getting there meant navigating the streets and hoping the herd was busy elsewhere. Getting back meant hauling a pack up 800 steps with an arm that screamed if air touched it. Both options were ugly. But doing nothing was a slow death. I gave it one night to stabilize. I changed the dressing, checked for immediate swelling, and popped a handful of over-the-counter painkillers that barely touched the throb. By morning, the burn felt like it was on fire, but the redness hadn't spread past the bandage. That bought me hours, not days. Before dawn, I repacked a lighter assault bag. Extra clothes and heavy tools stayed in the tower. I took water, a ration bar, the 38 with 2 speed loaders, a tactical light, duct tape, and my old field notebook with the addresses of the clinics I used to inspect. At the lobby level, I stood in the shadows of the main glass and scanned the plaza. Rain blew across the concrete in gusts. A few shapes moved in the distance, shambling, aimless, but none hugged the walls near my perimeter. The bodies from 2 days ago were gone. The service door opened with a reluctant scrape. I slipped through, pulled it closed, and engaged the lock. The staff lane outside was empty and slick with rain. My arm pulsed under the jacket with every heartbeat. The padlock on the outer gate still hung loose on the chain, waiting for me. The Space Needle rose behind me, a dark spike against the low clouds. For the first time since I'd claimed it, I turned my back on the tower voluntarily. I stepped out into the gray morning, heading toward the part of the city that still claimed to have medicine. The walk to the drugstore felt infinite. It was only 6 blocks on a map, but the city had changed the math on distance. Fewer cars moved, but more sat nose to nose in intersections with doors open and hoods up, creating blind spots everywhere. I stayed off the main arterials, navigating through service alleys and loading zones I knew from code inspections, keeping brick walls and parked delivery trucks between me and anything that sounded wrong. When a siren wailed once in the distance and then choked off, 3 shapes at the end of a cross street snapped their heads toward it with a loose, mechanical synchronization. One stumbled into a pothole, folded in half, then popped back up like its joints were spring-loaded. I took the next parallel street and didn't look back. The drugstore sat on a corner near a boarded-up urgent care. The front safety glass was spider-webbed, but still holding in the frame. The automatic sliding doors had been pried apart and hung askew. Inside, the air smelled of stale candy, spilled detergent, and something copper-sharp like dried blood. Shelves leaned drunkenly, and a toppled display of chips crunched under my boots. A dark drag mark ran down the center aisle toward the back, disappearing into the shadows. I stood just inside the vestibule, listening through the low hum of the emergency lights and a radio somewhere hissing static. And when no breathing or shuffling came back to me, I moved toward the pharmacy counter. The gate at the rear was locked, a cheap accordion shutter that wasn't built for a pry bar. I slid the steel tip of my tool under the latch, braced it against my hip, and with one hard twist that sent a jolt of fire through my burned arm, I snapped the mechanism. I didn't waste time reading every warning label. I swept what I knew and what I guessed into my pack. Amoxicillin, ciprofloxacin, Silvadene cream, sterile trauma pads, rolled gauze, medical tape, lidocaine spray, and a box of high-dose ibuprofen. By the time I zipped the bag, the straps dug into my good shoulder, and the shifted weight pulled my balance off-center. The burn under my jacket throbbed in time with my heartbeat, a wet, hot reminder of why I was taking this risk. Going back the same way felt like begging for a problem. Those 3 shapes I'd seen earlier were roaming that grid. I cut behind the clinic instead, using the brick walls and a concrete loading ramp as cover. When the street in front of me stayed empty for more than a breath, I crossed. When it didn't, I waited. That routine held until a shout cut through the rain from my left and a man's rough voice yelled, "Get behind something solid now!" I dropped behind a concrete planter, pressed my burned arm to my chest to protect it, and peeked over the rim. A runner came in fast from the far side of the lot, clothes torn, skin the color of wet ash, mouth open and red. It slammed into a parked sedan, bounced off, locked onto the sound of the shout, and sprinted again with a crooked, terrifying speed. A length of galvanized pipe swung in from the side, wielded by a man stepping out from behind a van. The pipe connected with the runner's knee with a wet crack. The leg folded backward. Before the thing could push up, the pipe came down again at the base of the skull, ending the noise instantly. Boots approached at a careful, measured pace. The man with the pipe stopped 10 yards away, kept the metal low but ready, and said, "If you're bit, stay down and say it. If you're clean, stand up slow with your hands where I can see them." I pushed to my feet with my good hand, keeping the burned arm tight against my ribs, and said, "I'm clean. No bite, no scratch. Just boiled my own arm trying to cook in a kitchen that wasn't built for one guy." He was lean, mid-30s, wearing a climbing helmet clipped to his pack and a coil of rope over one shoulder. 3 more people moved in from the periphery, spreading out to flank him without being told. A woman with a sawed-off pump shotgun took the angle that covered me in the street. A stocky man in a heavy Carhartt jacket watched the rear corners. The youngest, a kid in a courier's windbreaker with a bike helmet hanging from his strap, never stopped checking the rooftops. The woman looked at my bandage, then at the bulging pack and said, "You picked a hell of a time to hit a pharmacy." I shifted the weight, wincing as the strap pulled, and answered, "This arm was going to rot if I stayed put. The place I'm holding has food and water, but the first aid kit was a joke. I needed real antibiotics." The man with the pipe nodded once, eyes still scanning the street, and said, "Name's Harper. We didn't mean to spook you, but that thing was locked on your track. You coming out with a bag like that looked like bait." I took a breath, trying to ignore the pulsing pain, and said, "Dorian, I used to inspect half the buildings around Seattle Center. That includes the one with the best view in town." The courier checked the angle back toward the skyline, then looked at me and said, "So you really are up in the big tower?" We saw the barricades at the glass, but didn't see movement. I followed his stare toward the needle rising over the roofs and said, "I got into it before the lockdown. Been alone there a few days. It has height, 1 main stair, and doors I can reinforce. It doesn't have antibiotics, which is why I'm out here exposing myself." The woman adjusted her grip on the shotgun, keeping the barrel low but pointed generally at my knees, and said, "I'm Mira. Pipe is Harper, heavy jacket is Jonah, courier is Cass. We came in from the east, tried 2 designated shelters. Once someone turned inside the crowd, those places became slaughterhouses. I watched their hands and faces, tired, dirty, but disciplined, and said, Up there I have empty floors and 1 stair I know better every day. It's not perfect, but it beats guessing which hallway stays quiet at night." Jonah looked at my wrapped forearm, then at the bag, and said, "So the tower is stocked but short on manpower, and you stepped into this mess for the one thing it was missing." I nodded and answered, "If this burn went septic, none of the rest would matter. I needed to fix the weak point before it took the rest of me with it." Mira glanced at her group, then back at me and said, "We are 4 with no high ground and no plan past tonight. You are 1 with a fortress and a bad arm. That math is pretty loud." Cass hitched his pack higher and said, "If we walk toward your tower, what's the catch? You don't sound like the type who runs a bed and breakfast for strangers." I met his eyes and said, "No catch, just rules. We move while there's light, we stay off main roads, and if we make it inside the needle, nobody opens an outside door alone. Everybody takes watch, everybody hauls, everybody helps build. I am not giving up that stairwell to anyone who thinks they can take it." Harper rested the pipe across his shoulder, looked up at the low, heavy clouds, and said, "A roof with rules beats another night hoping a storage unit door holds. You know a path back that doesn't run straight into a horde?" I checked the alleys I had used, thought about the shapes I had seen, and said, "I know a line that was clear 20 minutes ago. We move quiet, we don't chase noise, and if something changes, we turn before it pins us." Mira finally lowered the shotgun a few inches, flicked the safety on, and said, "All right, Dorian from the tower. You get us to the base, and inside we follow your rules until we decide the place is worse than the street. If that happens, we walk without a fight. Until then, we work." It was more trust than I expected on wet concrete with a dead runner at our feet, but it was enough to move. We tightened straps, checked weapons, and fell into a rough tactical line. I took point because I knew the route. Mira fell in just behind me with the shotgun. Harper and Jonah took the middle, and Cass watched our 6. The Space Needle rose over the rooftops ahead, a dark spike in a gray sky. For the first time since I had walked into it alone, I was heading back to the tower with more than medicine. I was bringing the one thing the building couldn't provide, a crew to hold it. We stayed off the main arterials on the trek back. I led the stack through service alleys and narrow loading lanes I knew by heart from a decade of inspections. We ducked into the recessed doorway of a theater while slow, shuffling shapes crossed the intersection ahead of us. Once a runner flashed across the far end of the block, screaming at nothing, and turned toward a distant siren instead of our corner. Nobody spoke. Our breath misting in the cold air and the wet slap of boots on pavement were loud enough. When the Space Needle finally broke through the skyline, Cass let out a low whistle and whispered, "Man, that is wild," as he stared up at the saucer lost in the low clouds. For people who had been sleeping in parking garages and back rooms, it didn't look like a building. It looked like a spaceship that had crashed into the city. At the staff gate, the chain was still threaded through the bars exactly how I left it. I scanned the street, slid the padlock free, and eased the gate open just enough to create a gap. "From here on," I said, keeping my voice at a library volume, "we treat this lane like it is already inside the perimeter. No yelling, no banging gear on metal, no standing in the open to argue." Harper nodded once, taking up a rear guard position while the others filed in. When the gate swung back and the maglock engaged with a heavy clunk, the service lane felt like the first inch of solid ground we had stood on all day. The side door opened with the same reluctant scrape as before. Inside, the corridor smelled faintly of the violence I had left behind. A copper tang mixed with industrial cleaner. I shut the door, threw the deadbolt, and said, "Once we start climbing, this is home. If you decide you hate it, tell me in the morning, not halfway up the core." Mira looked at the steep angle of the service stairs and blew out a short breath that was almost a laugh, saying, "I already hate the stairs, but I'll climb a mountain if it means a roof with a lock on it." We moved up in single file. I kept the lead with the revolver low, pausing on the lobby landing. Through the glass of the internal door, the shapes of the dead guard and the maintenance man were still visible in the gloom of the lobby floor. Cass started to say something, but I cut him off with a raised hand and whispered, "Don't look at them. They're not going anywhere. We deal with the sanitation issues later. Right now, we get to high ground." We kept climbing. The ascent was brutal, flight after flight of concrete that made lungs burn and legs shake. The higher we went, the quieter it felt, until the chaos of the city faded into a low, vibrating hum beneath the concrete. On the observation level, I pushed the heavy fire door open and stepped aside to let them pass. The gray light of the overcast afternoon flooded in from the ring of glass. Tables sat in the odd defensive rows I had arranged. Near the core, my low wall of flipped banquet tables and the stack of blankets marked my sleeping corner. Water jugs lined one stretch of concrete like soldiers. Harper walked straight to the glass, looked down at the toy-sized cars and the empty plaza, and said, "You weren't kidding about the vantage point. From up here, you don't just see the street, you can see the weather coming." Jonah ran his hand along the smooth concrete of the inner core and said, "And nothing climbs a smooth column this high without heavy gear or a helicopter. This is defensible." Mira pointed at the single fire door we had just exited and said, "That's what matters. One choke point from out there to in here." I set my pack by the column, wincing as the strap slid off my bad shoulder, and pulled the folded menu from a crack in the concrete. One side was covered in my sharp handwriting. "These are the rules I've been running on," I said, handing it to the group. "We can adjust them as we go, but the basics stay. No opening external doors after dark unless fire or water is already in the room with you. No one goes down to ground level alone. Somebody is always on the stairwell watch when the rest are sleeping. We keep noise low and light discipline tight." Mira read it, then looked up and asked, "You wrote all this up here by yourself?" I nodded and answered, "No, talking to a wall gets old. Writing it down makes it harder to ignore the protocol when you're tired and want to cut corners." She handed it to Harper, who scanned it, snorted once, and said, "I've had landlords with stricter policies. I can live with this." We stood in a loose circle, shivering slightly in the unheated air, and turned skills into assignments. I gave them the sit rep on the building systems. Jonah said he could mechanically disable the elevators so they couldn't be called from the ground, ensuring the cars stayed trapped on the upper floors. Harper looked at the exposed steel beams of the ceiling and said he could rig a pulley system to haul weight, saving our backs on the stairs. Cass, who had a mental map of the city that rivaled a GPS, volunteered to log patrol routes and scavenge targets. When we got to Mira, she walked over to the kitchen, passed through one level down, and looked at the massive stainless steel hoods. "Those gas burners are running on line pressure," she said, "and that's going to fail. But look at the ventilation. Those hoods vent straight to the roof. If we can find a wood stove or build a firebox, we can pipe the smoke right into the existing ductwork. We won't have to break any glass or drill through the hull." I nodded, impressed, and said, "There's a storage room in the basement with 55-gallon steel drums. We might be able to fabricate a barrel stove." By the time the light outside started to fade into the purple bruised color of a winter evening, we had split the top into rough zones. We marked 3 more sleeping spots against the core, away from the drafts. We agreed on a watch rotation. 1 person on the stair landing below, 1 person walking slow circles on the observation deck. Before we ate, I opened the pack from the pharmacy on a clean table. The smell of rubbing alcohol cut through the stale air. Mira pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves, unwrapped my crude bandage, and checked the burn without flinching. "You did all right for 1 hand and a garbage kit," she said, applying a thick layer of the Sylvadine cream I had fought for. She wrapped it again with sterile trauma padding and secured it with real medical tape. The pain slid from a sharp, jagged edge to a dull, manageable throb, and the knot of fear that had pushed me out into the streets loosened. When darkness settled around the tower, we killed the overhead work lights and switched to a few shielded camping lanterns near the core. Outside, the city turned into dark blocks punctuated by scattered, uncontrolled fires. That first night with other people in the tower felt strange. Every shift of weight, every cough, every zipper sound had a new source. But having 4 more warm bodies inside the walls made the rules feel less like paranoia and more like policy. If we were going to keep this place, we had to act like it was a home worth defending. We started with the lowest hanging fruit, hardening the stairwell to ensure we could actually win a fight if the fight came to us. The observation level looked open and vulnerable, but the real choke points were the concrete landings below. Jonah and I walked the entire spiral with a clipboard, marking spots where the walls narrowed and the ceiling dropped. By the time we reached the lobby level, we had identified 3 kill zones, 1 near the ground floor breach, 1 at the midway point, and 1 just below our sleeping quarters. Back at the top, I laid the sketch on a table and traced the lines with a Sharpie. "These 3 turns matter more than any pane of glass on this ring," I said. "If someone breaches the front doors, I don't want them walking straight up to the view deck. I want them climbing into a wall." Harper tapped the middle mark on the paper and said, "This landing has a clean drop over the rail. We hang a hardened bar here, stack heavy debris behind it, and leave just enough of a gap to fire through. It creates a fatal funnel. They have to climb over, we just have to shoot down." We raided the storage cages for mass, stainless prep tables, heavy shelving units, bundled banquet chairs, and a defunct chest freezer became our bricks. Harper strung an old climbing rope across the stairwell void and used it as a primitive hoist while Jonah and I pushed from below. By midday, those 3 landings had transformed into narrow, jagged gates. Each had a steel bar secured at knee height to trip a runner, junk stacked waist-high behind it, and a clear, narrow strip at the wall side so we could squeeze through while an attacker would have to claw and scramble. We gave them simple, tactical names: bottom gate, middle gate, upper gate. Harper's next project was logistics. We needed to move supplies without blowing out our knees on the stairs. On the mechanical level under the ring, a short maintenance balcony wrapped part of the core. Harper drilled into the concrete with a battery-powered hammer drill, set expansion bolts, and hung a heavy-duty steel bracket we scavenged from the elevator room. When he clipped a carabiner and pulley into it, we had a functional freight lift. Cass stood at the bottom in the service lane, hooked loads to the rope, and gave 2 sharp tugs when they were clear. Crates, wood, and scavenged gear came up the side of the tower instead of on our aching shoulders. Heat was the next priority. The building's residual warmth was fading daily, and the ambient temperature inside was matching the freeze outside. Mira walked the restaurant level, inspecting the setup. She ignored the gas ranges and went straight to the back of the house, running her hand along the massive stainless steel exhaust hoods over the fry stations. "We don't need to cut holes in the walls," she said, looking up into the dark throat of the vent. "These hoods are designed to suck smoke out. Even with the fans off, the draft is there. We build the stove here under the hood and run the pipe straight up into the ductwork." It was the perfect fix. We found a 55-gallon oil drum in the basement maintenance shop. We moved it to the kitchen level, set it on fire bricks, and Jonah scavenged sections of galvanized pipe from the plumbing chase. Together, we cut a door in the drum, fitted the pipe, and sealed the connection to the hood vent with high-heat foil tape. When we lit the first test fire, the smoke curled lazily upward and vanished into the building's lungs while the radiant heat stayed in the room. Broken chairs, pallets, and cabinet doors became fuel. Mira organized the woodpile in a marked zone, enforcing strict fire safety rules. No loose scrap near the beds, and the fire never burned without eyes on it. Water transitioned from what's left in the pipes to a survival system. On day 5, the gravity tanks on the roof finally ran dry and the taps sputtered and died. We had anticipated it. We filled every container we had, pitchers, Cambros, plastic bins, and pushed them against the core for thermal mass. Then we looked up. The saucer shape of the tower was a natural funnel for rain. Harper and Cass went up to the roof with harnesses, found the drainage scuppers, and rigged heavy tarps to channel the runoff into downspouts we could access. The first night of steady Seattle rain filled 3 barrels with gray but drinkable water. Hygiene couldn't be an afterthought. In a confined space, dysentery kills faster than zombies. The bathrooms on the ring level became our sanitation zone. When the water pressure died, we switched to the bucket method. We lined 5-gallon buckets with heavy trash bags in one dedicated stall. Ash from the barrel stove was scooped in after every use to kill the smell and the bacteria. Filled bags were knotted, taped, and moved to a cold storage freezer 2 levels down, behind a sealed door marked biohazard. We set up a wash station with basins and a drain hose run to a floor sink. Mira set a hard rule. Anyone coming back from a scavenge run stripped to base layers, washed exposed skin, and changed clothes before touching common gear. Power was a tool, not a comfort. Jonah managed to get a small Honda generator running that he found in the maintenance garage. We siphoned gas from abandoned fleet vans and a city truck, filtering it through cheesecloth to catch the grit. We stored the fuel in marked jerry cans away from the sleeping area. The generator only ran in short, calculated bursts, just enough to charge our tactical headlamps, the 2-way radios, and a rechargeable battery bank. The rest of the time, we lived in red light discipline, using dim lanterns near the core and red filters on our headlamps to avoid turning the glass tower into a beacon for everyone in the city. From the safety of the ring, we learned the taxonomy of the threat below. Most of the dead were shamblers, slow, drifting aimlessly, dangerous only in a swarm. A smaller percentage were runners, bodies that moved with terrifying spasmodic speed, hitting obstacles and bouncing off without slowing down. The third type revealed itself on a gray Tuesday afternoon. A single figure stopped directly under the tower and let out a thin, piercing shriek that vibrated against the glass. It sounded like metal tearing. Within minutes, bodies from 3 blocks away turned and began converging on the sound. Cass watched them swarm and said, "That one calls the dinner bell." Harper grimaced and said, "Screamer," and the name stuck. Those 3 classifications dictated our rules of engagement. Shamblers meant we navigated around them. Runners meant no long sprints in the open and always checking our 6. Screamers meant absolute noise discipline was survival. Inside, we padded our boots and kept voices low. Outside, we chose routes that stayed away from echo chambers like alleyways where a single cry could pin us down. By the time the first real snow blew past the windows, sticking to the ledge, our days had settled into a rhythm. Morning checks of the gates, the door seals, and the hoist rope. Fire lit in the barrel stove just long enough to take the biting edge off the chill. Water hauled, filtered, and boiled. Food rationed into small, caloric portions. One scavenge run every 3 days, never fewer than 2 people, always with a hard time hack to be back. At night, 2 people stayed on watch. One listening at the stair gate, one walking slow, silent laps around the ring. One tap on the rail meant come here. 2 taps meant all clear. The Space Needle wasn't just a landmark anymore. It didn't turn into a stronghold by magic. It became a safe house, 1 bolt, 1 bucket, and 1 decision at a time. The building gave us height and a concrete shell. The rest came from sweat and from the choice to keep fixing the machine instead of waiting for someone else to save us. The first real test of our defenses arrived on a day that started deceptively quiet. A light snow had fallen overnight, leaving the streets wet and dark. From the ring, we could see fresh drag marks where shamblers had shuffled through the slush, but the plaza itself was empty. Inside, the barrel stove was burning low. Water barrels were full, and our list for the day was simple routine. Watch, wood, hoist, drafts. It felt almost normal, and that settled calm made me uneasy. Near midday, Cass tapped the rail once, the signal for eyes on, and when I stepped up beside him, he handed me the field glasses and said, "We've got contact." 4 packs, moving tactical. Figures moved toward the plaza in a loose line. They walked steady, not staggering. 2 carried rifles slung across their chests. 1 had a bat across his shoulders. The last pushed a stolen hotel luggage cart. They talked loud enough for the sound to carry, pointing at the boarded lower glass. Mira watched from the shadows and said, "They see we're alive. They're not passing this up." I kept my eyes on them and said, "We stay quiet until they make it our problem. If they walk past, fine. If they come to the doors, we treat them as a threat until they prove they're not." They did not walk past. The tall one in front checked the chain on the main doors, looked up at the tower, and led the group toward the staff lane. I left Mira and Cass at the glass and went down the stair. Harper was already behind the upper gate, rifle resting on the barricade, and when he heard me, he said, "So warning first or straight to kinetic?" I answered, "We warn once. If they push after that, we hold. I'll take the voice at the door, you hold the angle." On the lobby landing, I pressed my ear to the service door. Boots scraped on tile outside. After a pause, a fist hit the metal 3 times, hard and even. I raised my voice to project through the steel and said, "Back away from the door and stop hitting it. This building is occupied and defended. State your business or move on." For a moment, the hall outside stayed quiet. Then the tall one laughed and said, "Hear that? King of the Needle. We're looking for food and a place to sleep. You can share, or we can open this can and see what falls out." I kept my shoulder against the frame and said, "This is not a shelter. You are not coming inside. You have 1 chance to walk away while that choice is still yours." Someone muttered a curse. A boot hit the door harder. Metal boomed. The tone outside shifted from asking to taking. "We cleared 3 blocks to get here," the tall one said. "We're not turning around because a voice in a wall tells us no. Open the door or we open it for you." Above me, Jonah leaned on the rail and asked if I wanted him at my side. I did not take my eyes off the door and said, "Stay at the gate. If they get through down here, we fall back and make them pay for every step." The next impact shook the frame violently. A second later came the crack of a shot. The slug punched through the outer skin and buried in the sandbag we had stacked behind the lock. Dust shook loose from the hinges. Harper did not wait for them to line up again. From his spot at the upper gate, he fired once into the stone just above the door. The report slammed around the stairwell like a grenade. Outside, boots scrambled and someone shouted. Another round hit higher and went wide. I flinched at the sound. Gunfire in a glass tower was a nightmare scenario. 1 high, stray bullet could shatter our hull. But the noise was a weapon too. Through the narrow window by the landing, I saw shapes change direction on the street. Slow bodies that had been drifting with no goal began to move toward the sound. A runner cut across a side street, slipped in the snow, popped back up, and locked on the noise at our door. The 4 at the entrance had just made themselves the loudest target in a wide circle. I called one last time through the steel and said, "This is your last warning. Look behind you. Stay here and you'll be the closest meat when they get bored of the sound." The answer was another kick and a shouted curse. They had made their choice. We let the street work. Outside, shamblers came in from both sides, drawn by shots and movement. The runner broke into a sprint toward the knot of bodies at our door. For a few seconds, they tried to fight both us and the dead. One of them turned to fire and left his side open. Another backed straight into a slow one he had not seen. From our side, we held fire and listened. Harper watched through his crack at the gate and said, "They're losing this, they're panicked." The noise shifted. Boots scraped. Someone screamed. The cart tipped. One rifle kept firing until it clicked empty. After a while, the gunshots stopped. Only dull impacts and low sounds remained, then even those faded. I went up one flight and joined Harper at his view slot. Bodies lay in a heap near the steps. Some still twitched. Most did not. The tall one who had talked big was on his back with 3 dead things over him. When his arm moved, it moved wrong. After a few spasms, it stopped. Mira stepped close enough to see and said, "If we had opened for them, that would be up here with us." Nobody argued. We stayed off the windows for the rest of the day. Slow ones drifted around the plaza, stepped over bodies and moved off once the noise was gone. That night, I took the menu down from the core, added one more line, and taped it back up. If a group comes armed, shouting, and already trying to give orders, we do not argue twice. We refuse, we hold, and we let the street decide what happens to them. The tower is not a prize they can shout their way into. The test cost us a few rounds and a lot of adrenaline, but it changed the way we saw the building. Until then, some part of me had still filed this place under "Until Rescue." After that, it moved to Fortress. Not everyone was worth opening the door for. We checked the door frame for cracks, dug a fresh pocket in the sandbag where the slug had stopped, and added another crossbar behind the metal. The tower had held its first real push. Our job now was to make sure the next one hit harder walls. The days following the failed raid settled into a heavy, deceptive calm. It wasn't peace, it was just a stretch of time where nothing hammered on our doors and nobody pointed a rifle at the glass. The weather turned, shifting from the constant Seattle drizzle to a hard, biting sleet that eventually turned to snow. The heat from our jury-rigged barrel stove became the gravitational center of our world. We took shifts feeding it, listening to the wind howl in the vent hood above, grateful that the smoke was being sucked out of the building instead of choking us out. But as the external threat quieted down, the internal weak spots started to shift. It wasn't strangers at the gate anymore, it was our own habits. Complacency is a quiet killer. I saw it when Cass started cutting the timing too close on watch changes, leaving 30-second gaps in coverage. I saw it when Harper worked the rope hoist with numb hands instead of warming them first, risking a load drop. I saw it when Jonah spent too many hours alone with the generator staring at the wall, and when Mira stayed in the wash zone scrubbing clothes until her fingers turned waxy and white. I watched the team drift into that 1,000-yard stare and realized the next failure likely wouldn't come from a bullet. It would come from a mistake. We tightened the screws immediately. The watch change protocol went back to a hard 5 minutes of verbal handover instead of a tired nod. What changed, what broke, what hurts became the mandatory mantra. If someone answered nothing 3 times in a row, they were pulled off the line and forced to sit by the stove and talk. We cut the hoist work into shorter, high-intensity blocks and instituted a warm hands rule. No one touched a rope if they couldn't feel their fingertips. The generator ran strictly by the logbook, 20 minutes a day to top off the tactical batteries, nothing else. By the time we marked our 30th sunrise in the tower, 30 rough nights of sleeping on concrete, the Space Needle didn't feel like a tourist landmark anymore. It felt like a machine we had bolted back together around ourselves. We knew exactly which fire doors had a tendency to stick in the cold and which floor bolts had to be checked twice a day. We knew which panes of glass whistled when the wind hit 40 knots and which ones were already gone, replaced by plywood and silence. Below us, the city kept sliding into entropy. Some streets stayed quiet but felt wrong, clogged with cars stalled at aggressive angles. The shamblers wandered in smaller, tighter groups, huddling for warmth. The runners showed up less often in the freezing temps, but when they did, they moved with the same terrifying kinetic energy. Screamers appeared at a distance now and then, their cries muffled by the snow. When we saw them, we maintained strict light discipline, stayed off the glass, and let them waste their noise on empty walls. On the night of day 30, the snow came in hard, sticking to every ledge and turning the plaza below into a blank white sheet. The sound of the city dropped to a muffled whisper. We gathered on the observation level near the core, with the stove burning down to embers and a single shielded lantern giving us amber light. We all knew the count because we had been marking it in the logbook since the day I walked out of my apartment. I looked at the exhausted faces around the fire and said, "If anyone wants to punch out, this is the window. The streets are quiet tonight. No hard feelings if this life isn't sustainable for you." The silence stretched for a moment. Then Jonah leaned back, tapped his boot against the concrete and said, "I'd rather have one stairwell I understand than 100 hallways I don't. I'm staying." Mira stirred the fire and added, "This stove, the water catchment, the hygiene protocols, we built a system that beats freezing to death in a basement. I'm not walking away from the work." Harper looked out at the swirling snow beyond the glass and said, "The view isn't about the scenery anymore. It's about the warning time. I like seeing the bad news before it knocks on my door." Cass, usually the most restless, just shrugged and said, "I'm tired of learning new ceilings. This one is high enough." For the first time since I stepped through that side door with a pack on my shoulder and a revolver in my belt, I didn't feel like I was holding the sky up alone. The tower still needed work every single day. The rules still mattered. One bad call could still get us all killed. But now there were 4 other people who could hear a wrong sound, spot a weak weld, or stand a watch without me. We were a unit. Looking back, the building didn't save us. The architecture gave us an advantage, sure, but we saved ourselves by choosing the right kind of ground and then treating it like something that could fail at any moment. Height and thick walls made it easier, but they didn't change the basics. Doors had to be checked, water had to be filtered, heat had to be managed, waste had to be handled. Survival isn't about the strongest walls, it's about the strictest routines. You might never see the inside of the Space Needle. You might be listening to this in a suburban house, a second-floor apartment, a basement, or a stockroom above a grocery store. The shape of your shelter is different, but the work is exactly the same. Find one place you can actually hold. One stair, one hallway, one yard with a fence line you can see from end to end. Walk your building while you still can. Count the doors. Learn which windows latch tight and which ones rattle. Figure out which spots would make good fatal funnels if you had to block a hallway in a hurry. Store water in real food-grade containers, not just open buckets. Most of all, do not plan to do this alone if you have any choice. I started this operation in an empty tower and thought solitude was a tactical advantage. It took a severe injury and a desperate walk into a hostile grid to remind me that one set of hands is not enough. A small team with clear jobs, clear rules, and a shared goal will hold more ground than one solitary survivalist with a hiding place and no backup. If you are watching this with a roof over your head and a door you can lock, you have more than most people did when this started. Think about what would break first if the power grid died tonight or the street outside turned bad. Fix what you can. Plan for what you can't fix yet. If this debrief helped you picture your own safe spot, do me a favor. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps the algorithm push this intel to other people who might be checking their exits right now. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what your plan B looks like. Stay warm, stay alert, and do not wait for someone else to make the hard decisions for you.